So this week's Torah portion is called Parashat Va'era. Va'era means, I have shown myself, says God, to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, to the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they never questioned my ways. You, Moshe, wondered why my people, your people, our people are suffering, even though I promised you they would go free from Egypt. So this is a response to a complaint Moses made at the end of last week's Parashas Shmos. Moshe had challenged God, why have you made things worse for them? And God says, no one challenged me before like you are, and I will show you, I will prove to you, prove to Pharaoh, to the Egyptians, and to the Jewish people ultimately, that I will in fact take you out of Egypt in a most amazing way. And this week is where the famous plagues, the 7 out of 10 plagues are mentioned in this week's Torah portion. Next week we'll get the final 3. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe comments on the first 2 of this week's 7 plagues. Why? Because he wants to put into perspective for us the concept, the idea of what plagues are for. In general, most people think of plagues as a punishment, as something where God gets so angry at these people who enslaved the Jews, he wants to pay back, he wants to take revenge, he wants to avenge the Jewish people and destroy the Egyptians, but he wants to do it slowly, torture them, one plague at a time, because we all know that God could easily have skipped to plague number 10, where he threatens the lives of the Egyptians, or better yet, he can just threaten that he's going to wipe them out and decimate them in a single moment. And God seems to take the option where he slowly tortures them during the 10 plagues. The mistake is, and the misconception is, that in fact these plagues were meant as punishments. If they were simply meant to be punishments for the Egyptians, it wouldn't be so relevant for us to know all the details of how God punished them. You can just find out that the Egyptians enslaved the Jewish people, and God saved the Jewish people by scaring the Egyptians into letting us go, into letting the Jewish people go. The reason why the details of all these plagues are relevant today is not because they were meant as punishments, but rather they were meant to be educational. There is an educational component to each of the 10 plagues that God was giving to the Egyptians. It was meant to be somewhat educational for the Egyptians themselves. The Egyptians themselves have an opportunity to stop thinking that God is angry at them and punishing them, but rather God is trying to guide them. In general, in life, when people are going through a hard time, they come to the conclusion immediately that God hates them, God is angry at them, God wants to punish them, when in fact we believe that everything God is doing for us is for our good, and in some cases he does things to us that hurt us, but it's to guide us. The objective is to guide us into becoming a better person. And we can either be bitter people who say, why me? Or we can be people who are smart enough to recognize that, why me? Because I need to grow from this. The Egyptians obviously didn't get the message. After plague number 1, which had a specific educational component to it, as we will mention in a moment, after plague number 2, they still didn't grasp, they didn't let themselves be educated. They continued to be wicked and enslave the Jewish people and torture them. And that's the reason why there had to be another plague, until God finally at the end, after 10, says, look, obviously my education, my guidance is not working for you. You're just going to have to let the people go by force. I'm going to force you to let them go. What is the educational component of plague number 1? Which included God taking all the waters of Egypt and turning it into blood. It's the strangest thing why God chose these specific kinds of punishments for the Egyptians, unless you believe in this Hasidic philosophy that the Rebbe is presenting, that there is a spiritual component, an educational component, which is as follows. Water, according to Judaic Hasidic philosophy, represents that which is cold and wet. Water represents a certain coldness. Water in its natural state is cold. And more specifically, it represents the coldness and insensitivity and indifference that a person may have to Kedusha, to holiness, to that which is sacred. A person may be very, very indifferent to a lecture that is very inspiring. A person may be very, very uninspired by an event that seems to have everybody else talking about it and getting excited about it, and they remain cold and cool and collected, and it's not such a big deal. So water represents that indifference. When it says that God turned the water into blood, the reference is, the idea, the symbolism is, that the water, the cold water, is being transformed into blood, warm blood. Blood is what gives us life. We have life. Blood represents a person who is passionate. Sometimes blood goes to his head. You see him get all red in the face and excited about something. Blood represents the ingredient that makes up the passion of life, the excitement in life. When the blood is circulating in a healthy way, that means the person is very into what they're doing. So changing the water into blood means changing the indifference to that which is sacred to getting excited about something that happens, something sacred that happened, or an object that is sacred, or a ritual that is sacred. Then comes the next plague, the frogs. In this plague, a swarm of frogs, a massive infestation of frogs comes upon Egypt and annoys them. You can either see this as a punishment, that God is so angry at the Egyptians for the way he's treating the Jewish people, that he really wants to annoy the living daylights out of them and annoy the night times of these Egyptians because they can't sleep and they can't do anything properly. So the frogs come to annoy them. Or there's a certain educational component for the Egyptians of 3,000 years ago, and there's an educational component to the person who decided to read the Torah this week in this week's Torah portion, and there's guidance for them in the year 2012 as to how to deal with various things in the world. So whereas the first plague taught us to stop being indifferent to the miracles that happen on a regular basis in our lives and around the world, the plague of the frogs teaches us almost the exact opposite. The frogs represent that which is cold and indifferent because they come from water. They usually hang out in the water. They have more of an association to the water, which represents indifference. And yet, these frogs jumped out of the water, out of the Nile River they came. And it says God commanded the frogs that they should go everywhere. So it says the frogs went everywhere, even in places where you would least expect them. Where is a place that you would least expect a frog? So it says they went and they infested them. They were so infested inside the homes of the Egyptians. They even went into the kitchens and they jumped into the dough and into the food that they were preparing, and they even jumped into the ovens. The verse makes a point of mentioning that they actually jumped into the ovens. You have to ask yourself, why do you have to tell us that detail? We get the point. They jumped everywhere. We assume they went everywhere. Why tell us that they went into the ovens? Because the ovens is the exact opposite atmosphere of the habitat that they are used to. An oven is dry, unlike the swamps where the frogs come from, and an oven is very hot. They jumped into the ovens to be inside the food of the Egyptians because they were so in tune with godliness. When God told these frogs to go everywhere, they took it pretty seriously. And they were trying to educate, God was trying to educate the Egyptians by showing him that even these frogs will go to the exact opposite extreme to what they're used to just to do what God wants. And this represents the idea of the frogs. When they jumped into the Egyptian ovens, it symbolized the idea. The Egyptian ovens was symbolic of how the Egyptians were passionate about everything that wasn't sacred. They were passionate about things that were impure. They had their heads completely involved in serving the Nile and serving idols and doing things that were immoral and uncultured and unethical. That's what they were excited about. The frogs, the cold frogs that came from a cold environment, came to cool off their ovens, to cool off their passions. Because the other issue that people deal with till today, thousands of years later, and that's why the plagues and talk about the plagues at the Seder table on Passover and in this week's Torah portion is so relevant today,